Earlier, all these slides go up on the. I record the lecture up on, put them up on YouTube. So if you actually check the YouTube, you'll find the last week's lecture there, where I went through the idea of value, thermodynamics, and dialectics. And I see the essential question about value is how do we produce more outputs than inputs? And the only answer that's correct in terms of thermodynamics is by exploiting free energy. Now it's more than that, obviously, but that's the essential thing. You have to say you've got to be exploiting free energy to actually create that excess of outputs over inputs. And economic theory should be compatible with this, but it wasn't, largely because economics, both the classical school and the mainstream school, developed independently of thermodynamics, weren't informed by it, and therefore you have theories that don't actually make sense in that way. Now, I'm not saying you should reduce economics to thermodynamics. Okay, that's exactly like I'm not saying you reduce biology to chemistry. There's a layer above chemistry for biology. Otherwise, as I said last year, you'd need to have a normal biology question was, please create life using these chemicals, which of course you can't do. So it's an independent level, but it can't be inconsistent with thermodynamics. And the only theory I think that is the original physiocratic argument. The strict labour theory of value is incompatible. And I'll explain why from a couple of perspectives today. But if you look at the logic that Marx worked with, which is this dialectical logic, then you can find an alternative foundation that's compatible. And the basic way I describe this, and Marx never writes this down in any clear sense. You have to read a large amount of Marx to get this feeling for how he actually thinks. But he starts by saying any component of a society, whether that's a human being or a commodity or money or anything else you care to name, is a social unity. So it's got an existence in its own right, but it can't be understood independent of the society in which it's in. And that's why I use that little analogy about if you go to a party and somebody asks you, what do you do? I ask you, what do you do? Your answer is the work you do, or that you're a student, that sort of thing. If you went to a party 1,000 years ago, the question would be, what rank are you? If people couldn't tell from your clothing immediately. So a different society will focus upon different things and bring those into the foreground. Now, in capitalism, the foreground is your contribution to production. That's what becomes the foreground aspect. But that pushes the other aspects of the unity into the background, and you can't exist without those other aspects. So what you get is like a stretching, a tension put into that unity. And you have to understand both the background and the foreground, and that tension between the two can actually lead to transformation both of the unity and the society in which it's embedded. That's the basic logic that Marx works with. And by the way that I represent that visually is imagine a society as a circle, and then you have some unity which is embedded in that society. Now that unity, society will focus on some particular aspect to make that the foreground aspect of that unity. Therefore, the rest of of that entity gets pushed into its background, but because it can't exist without both the background and the foreground, there's a tension, a dialectical tension, and that's the basic way that I've tried to visualise how Marx thinks about society in general. And what it gives you is the theory of value, first of all, that contradicts the labour theory of value, but it's compatible with thermodynamics. It's not based on thermodynamics, but it is compatible with the concept of thermodynamics, and it also leads to a very complex systems vision of the economy, where you have multiple interacting price levels and dynamics between prices and the distribution of income, which I'll just point out later has had some rather interesting empirical confirmation. So first of all, why the labour theory of value goes. Now, is anybody, we don't have Mark in the room, unfortunately. He wasn't here for this particular lecture last year either. Went into much more detail this year than last year. Who's read a lot of Marx? Anybody? Okay, nobody. So this is all going to be relatively new to you. So Marx began as a philosopher. He was always known as, his nickname was the Moor, because he was so dark-skinned and so swarthy and so heavily bearded. That's him as a young man when he was a philosopher. And he wrote a PhD in philosophy. And this was what he wrote in the preface to that, because he was writing a critique of Hegel, effectively. Hegel was not his teacher. Hegel, I think, was dead by the time Marx was learning philosophy. But he learned from Hegelian-influenced academics. He's probably the first economist we'd refer to actually has a PhD, because there's no such thing as a PhD in economics. Of course, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations or Quenet did his thing, there was no accepted body of thought, nor was there when Marx wrote, but he did a PhD in philosophy, so the first person to have a doctorate who became a famous economist. Now, he says, starts in talking about his critique, that it's conceivable that a philosopher should be guilty of this or that inconsistency because of this or that compromise. He may himself be conscious of it, which I find a fascinating statement given what turns up later in Marx's own writing. But what he's not conscious of is that in the last analysis, this apparent compromise is made possible by the deficiency of his own principles or an adequate grasp of them. And he then says, so if that's the case, if a philosopher really has compromised, it's the job of his followers to use the inner core of his thought to eliminate his own superficial expression of it. Okay? I wish that's what Marx's followers has done, because I think they've done the exact opposite. They've preserved the mistakes he made rather than the actual advances. And that's from the preface to his doctoral dissertation, which has been published, of course. Now, after he finished his PhD, he couldn't get a job as an academic. He'd gone from being a moderately conservative background to quite radical and involved in student politics and all those sorts of things, which meant back in Prussian, German, or pre-German Prussia, the state of Prussia, he couldn't get a job as an academic. He was blocked. So he started working for left-wing newspapers as well that had started springing up at this time in Germany. And what he covered in particular was the dispossession of peasants from the Black Forest. So peasants used to have feudal-based rights to go and use the Black Forest to pull out various products. I'm not sure what they are, but that was one of the rights they had. They were being dispossessed in the formation of commercial agriculture. Those rights were being denied. And he saw this as the beginning of capitalist farming, but he realised his philosophy had taught him nothing about capitalism. And he really didn't understand what the hell was going on. So when he got, but not just radicalised by the whole experience of seeing this happen, and also kicked out of Prussia, so made into a political exile when he went to France, but he decided, well, I haven't actually learned how the economy functions, so I have to read economics. And he locked himself effectively in a garret in Paris and wrote what we've since called the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. And what he did was he just basically read everything he could find by Smith, Ricardo, Say, other writers at the same time, who established the classical school of economics, and that was the dominant school of economics at the time. Say was not part of the classicals, but certainly Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and so on were people he was reading in great, great detail, took copious notes, and they were later published as this book. And effectively, it's like having your notes for an essay published as a book. Okay? It was not written as a thing for publication. It was just his own note-takings he went through, reading all these things he found in Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and so on. And you can see two things when you read this. And if you are going to read Marx, I do recommend reading him chronologically. Only because if you start, well, you can read Capital One, which is where I first read Marx, but if you really want to understand it, go back and see his writings right from 1844 through, and then you'll get a feeling for how his ideas changed over time. So you can see how tentative his original arguments were, and he was making statements about Smith, which, when you look at them, contradict the labour theory of value. So he hadn't actually got to the stage of believing in the labour theory of value at the time. So he starts off in taking his notes on Smith. Says the capitalist thus makes a profit first on the wages and secondly on the raw materials advanced to him. Now that's a direct contradiction of the labour theory of value that argues you can only make a profit out of the labour input. Okay? I'm not saying it's wrong, okay? But it's contradictory to the labour theory of value. He was also antagonistic about it. You can see his spleen rising as he reads how the economists talk about human beings as chattels, effectively. So he says, this political economy begins by seeming to acknowledge man. It must throw aside this hypocrisy and come out with complete cynicism by developing the idea of labour much more sharply as the sole essence of wealth, proving the implication of the theory to be anti-human in character. Okay? So he's quite critical of what he's reading at the time. And he makes statements which look like utilitarianism in one way. They're saying utility determines value. But they're also, when you read them properly, they're early attempts to apply dialectics. He's just recently finished his PhD in philosophy. He's the leading dialectician in Germany, when he was in Germany. He wasn't acknowledged as such in terms of official position, but he was heads and shoulders above his peers in his knowledge of philosophy. And he criticised Ricardo and Say for saying when they're having a debate in between the two of them over thrift versus luxury, He says there'd be no production without consumption. Now that's again its own way, it's a form of a dialectic. He says it is use that determines the thing's value, and fashion determines use. This is Marx stating his own opinions here at the time. And he says both sides forget that extravagance and thrift, luxury and privation, wealth and poverty are equal. In other words, they're dialectical pairs, opposites of each other, in that sense of foreground and background being the opposites of each other. And so the character of private property expressed by labour relations, etc., have to pass through. Now notice here, unmediated or mediated unity of the two. So this whole idea of unity is turning up in his language. Unity, foreground and background elements. Capital and labour at first still united, then separated. Second, the two in opposition, so the foreground versus the background, that dialectical tension. The worker knows the capitalist is his known non-existence. Each tries to rob the other of his existence, etc., etc. So get the feeling for the philosophy here. And he's trying to use his own intellectual foundations now to understand the economics he's reading. Third, opposition of each to itself. Capital is stored up labour, splitting capital itself into interest and profit, etc., etc. Again, these are the sort of notes you'd write down if you're writing notes on somebody's writings for an essay. Okay, if it doesn't look like it's coherent as a book, it's not. It literally is the notes he took when he's trying to understand what he was reading in the classical economists and say. Splitting labour into itself on the wages of labour. Okay, that's almost the value of labour and value and labour power at that stage. The worker himself a capital, a commodity, clash of mutual contradictions. So you feel this real clash between, first of all, he's critical from a philosophical point of view of the very commodified way that economic theory treats entities in society, including human beings, obviously. Then you feel him trying to apply his philosophy, but that starts to drift, that starts to disappear. And you'll see this happening when he starts talking in his communications with Proudhon. This is a time of huge political... I hate the way this floor makes noises as I move. This annoys the hell out of me. It's like I weigh 150 kilos. It's a time of a huge political conflict in Paris as well. And Marx actually said one of his ambitions was to combine German philosophy with English political economy and French politics. You know, that was the combination he thought he was kind of trying to bring together. That was his vision at the time. He's got the philosophy, and there's a real clash in his mind about how he brings the philosophy together with the economics. But he's being persuaded by the economics as he reads it. And then he starts to refine Ricardo's solutions because he found holes in Ricardo as well. And I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. And what he did was to solve the dilemma that Ricardo himself had not really solved. He's simply taken it for granted. That how do you make a profit if all commodities exchange at their value? Because one big difference between the neoclassical, which we're all used to, unfortunately, and the classical schools, the neoclassical school argues that there's this marginal this and marginal that setting value. They don't really explain where profit comes from. Okay? Whereas the classical school said things exchange at their value. So you buy something for its value, you produce using it, you sell at its value. So there's equivalence there. How do you make a profit? And Ricardo took it for granted that a profit occurred, but you find Marx accepting that as he continues writing after 1844, and he starts to abandon, or he really quite literally abandons, the dialectical approach. Now, and then again, this is an intellectual development. He comes back to it 13 years later, as I'll show you. But in what he did when he was involved in all this politics back in France in the 1840s, anarchists were a major political faction at the time. Communists actually were more defined by Marx's work with Engels than they were as a strong political faction at the time. The anarchists in some ways were more organised, more stronger. And Proudhon was one of the leading anarchists. And Proudhon went to Marx to have Marx explain German philosophy to him. So Marx attempted to teach Proudhon dialectical philosophy. And then Proudhon wrote a book called The Philosophy of Poverty. And Marx was absolutely disgusted with the way that Proudhon completely misunderstood or misapplied what he tried to teach him as dialectics. So here's Proudhon. And I haven't read the original Proudhon. I'm reading Marx's quotes here. There's one mistake I've had in my HET that I haven't actually read Proudhon in the original. I must make up for that one day. But the economists have very well explained the double character of value, but they've not set up with equal clearness its contradictory nature. He said it's a small, and this is very flowery Proudhon language, this is not Marx writing now, it's a small matter to signalise to utility value and exchange value this astonishing contrast. And so Proudhon thinks he's making a huge advance here. It is necessary to show this printed simplicity hides a profound mystery, which is our duty to penetrate. In technical terms, use value and exchange value are in an inverse ratio, the one to the other. This is Proudhon attempting to apply the dialectic that Marx has just taught him. So that's Marx citing Proudhon, and he wrote his reply. This was a book. This was an actual reply as a pamphlet. Proudhon's book was called The Philosophy of Poverty. Marx has come back with the poverty of philosophy. He's really saying, up yours, this is dreadful stuff. Okay? And he's quite contemptuous. And look at the language now. See, this is now Marx again. I compare what I showed you just one slide ago and the language Marx was using in his attempt to understand the classical school. See how that compares to what he writes when he's critiquing Proudhon just a couple of years later, 1846. See, we will leave to the reader to compare the precise, clear and simple language of Ricardo with the rhetorical efforts made by Monsieur Proudhon in an attempt to arrive at the determination of relative value by labour time. Ricardo shows us the real movement of bourgeois production. Mr. Proudhon makes abstractions of this movement, struggles to invent new processes, which is only a theoretical expression of the real existing movement so well propounded by Ricardo. So he's completely accepted Ricardo's way of thinking at this stage. He says, Ricardo takes for his point of departure existing society to demonstrate how it constitutes value. Monsieur Proudhon takes for his point of departure constituted value, which is talking about this use value, exchange value stuff that Proudhon is coming up with here. It says, the determination of value by labour time is for Ricardo the law of exchange value. For Monsieur Proudhon, it is a synthesis of use value and exchange value. He's just dismissing Proudhon's attempt to apply dialectics to understand the classical theory of value. And that's going to come back very interestingly about 13 years later in Marx's writing. So he accepts initially this classical distinction between use value and exchange value of a commodity. Now again, we talk about, in neoclassical theory, talks about utility and cost, okay, and marginal utility and marginal cost. A similar division applies here, but there's no concept of marginality to it. There's a gap between the two, and I want to explain where that comes from. So here is Smith, I think this is from Smith, talking about value having two meanings. Sometimes it expresses the utility of an object, other times its power of using that object to purchase other goods, so that's the exchange value. And Ms. Smith says one is called value in use, the other value in exchange. Now initially, exchange value is seen as the only determinant of price. Utility or use value plays no role. And I think this is from Ricardo. Utility then is not the measure of exchangeable value, although it's absolutely essential to it. So the argument is that utility plays no role in setting price beyond the fact that if something doesn't have utility, you won't be able to sell it in the first price. So it's a prerequisite, but it's not part of forming price. And then here's again Ricardo continuing. If a commodity were nowhere useful, it would be destitute of exchange value, no matter how much labour went into making it. So utility is a prerequisite, but it plays no role in setting the price itself. So that's the vision that Ricardo and Smith had, which at this stage effectively Marx completely accepts. And when you think about why does this happen, it's partly focusing on long-run costs. This is what the classical school focused on, what they called centres of gravity in the economy. And one centre of gravity, they said, was that yes, there may be market situations which will drive price above cost of production or drive price below cost of production at various times, but everything's going to cycle around this cost of production. So here's Ricardo saying it is the cost of production which must ultimately regulate the price of commodities, and not, as often has been said, the proportion between supply and demand. That's completely contradictory to the neoclassical stuff you guys have learnt in your own training, and it dominates the profession today. But if you think about, even within that neoclassical perspective, with that whole idea of a long-run average cost curve, the argument is in the long run that's where price returns to. So in that sense, there's a meeting point there. The classical school doesn't really worry about the fluctuations around that value. And then here's, again, Ricardo elaborating. Diminish the cost of production of hats and their price will ultimately fall to the natural price, even if demand doubles or triples or quadruples. So they're really saying, again, this is another division that doesn't apply in the neoclassical school. The neoclassical tries to bring everything together and say supply and demand set price. Okay, you've got to include them both. here's what's being argued effectively by Ricardo, is that the price is set by the cost of production, the quantity is set by demand. There's a division there you don't get in the neoclassical. And then diminish the cost of subsistence of men by diminishing the natural price of food or clothing, and wages will ultimately fall, notwithstanding the demand for labourers may very greatly increase. So it's dividing up tasks which are combined together in the neoclassical vision. Okay? Cost of production sets price, demand sets quantity. Now Marx fully accepted that early on, and his method was to say that use value is a prerequisite for exchange, but it plays no role in setting the price. And then use value, therefore, is normally qualitative, but it's objective. Rather than waffling on about the comfort one feels of sitting in a chair and whether this chair makes you more comfortable than another chair, or whether one person finds this chair more comfortable than another person does, the chair's utility is that you can sit in it. Okay? It's not looking at the qualitative aspects that much. Whereas in the exchange value front, the exchange value between two commodities is set by the amount of labour time that it takes to produce them, which again is something you'll find in Smith. Now Marx's advance over Ricardo here was to say, I can use this and I can explain profit, whereas Ricardo didn't in any proper sense really explain where the profit originates, of everything buying and being bought and sold at its value. And here's Marx talking about his own improvement on Ricardo's. Ricardo starts out from the actual fact of capitalist production. The value of labour is smaller than the value of the product which it creates. And here's this whole question, how do you produce a surplus turning up in a different guise? The excessive value of the product over the value of the wages is surplus value. For him it is a fact. The fact the value of the product is greater than the value of the wages. How this fact arises remains unclear. Now again, I want to emphasise this. Marx was driven by the need to give a complete theory. He really wanted to explain everything. He wasn't happy when there was something he had to assume at some point to get to the next stage. And I'll come back to that when I'm talking about the Grundrisse later. The total working day is greater than that part of the working day which is required for the production of wages. Why? That does not emerge. This is Marx writing. This is now what's called the theories of surplus value, and he goes back and rereads all the classical theory yet again, going back, and he's now trying to explain where that comes from. Now, he had what I'm calling a Ricardian explanation here. He comes up with a different explanation in 1857, which is part of where this actual statement is taken from. But back in the early days, just after he'd read Ricardo and Smith and Malthus and so on, he focused upon the unique characteristics of labour. And he said profit arises because of the difference between the cost of production of labour power, which is the means of subsistence. If you want to produce a worker, effectively you've got to provide the means of subsistence and reproduction, obviously, but enough to enable that. So you basically, to hire a worker, its cost of production is the means of subsistence that will keep a worker alive for a day. But what the productive ability is, the ability to be put to work by a capitalist. So he says the worker receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labour power, but the capitalist receives in exchange for his means of subsistence labour, the productive activity of the worker. The creative power by which the worker not only replaces what it consumes, but gives to the accumulated labour a greater value than it previously possessed. So he's saying the gap between the cost of production of a worker, which is the means of subsistence, and the amount of goods a worker can produce in a defined time period, that's his explanation for where surplus comes from. Now, that led to some of the greatest rhetorical flourishes in Marx's work. It gave him the whole idea of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, because the argument went along with this was, as well as labour being the only source of value, Marx also argued that over time there's a tendency for the capital-labour ratio to rise, which means the rate of profit has a tendency to fall. And it also led to the argument of the inevitability of crises in socialism. But it also gave them the greatest technical flaws, because if you start by saying that profit comes only from labour, and you acknowledge that different industries have different capital-labour ratios, then you have the industries that have more labour producing more value, and yet you're also arguing that profit equalises between, there's a tendency for profits to equalise between sectors as well. That leads to what's called the transformation problem. It also is rather, I've got my own theoretical argument for saying the rate of profit does not fall, and I'll talk about that in later lectures. But the idea that there was a terminal crisis for capitalism didn't work all that well. The original argument was this would happen in the most advanced capitalist nations. It had happened in America and England first because they were the most capitalist. Where did the revolutions occur? In the most backward, Russia, China, etc., etc. So even in that sense, that didn't work. And then, of course, you go to the collapse of socialism. That puts a complete hole in the whole argument about capitalism having to come to an end, and having to come to an end as it progresses, which, of course, was not the way that things occurred politically and historically. And it also conflicts with the laws of thermodynamics, because labour can't produce a surplus without energy. Now, you can say labour embodies energy, and I'll talk about that in that argument as well later, but other things can too. Why just labour? If you had a normal lecture on Marx, you'd be getting a whole lot of stuff on equations about S divided by C plus V, and I'm not going to do that. Okay? I just think that's a waste of time. And I'll talk about that a bit if you like later, but I'm not going to bother with that. I see that as focusing on the wrong elements in Marx rather than where the real insights can come from. Because what you find later in Marx in 1857-58, so 13 years after he first read Ricardo in the classical school in general, he has a chance rereading. I think it's, I say logic here, but I actually just read recently, it may be a different work. I'll need to take a look at that in a moment. But he had a chance rereading of Hegel's work while he was writing the Grundrisse. Now, the Grundrisse is, does anybody speak German here? Is that correct to say rough draft still? Grundrisse? So it's the rough draft of Capital, okay? And he was writing it because starting in 1857 he thought the final crisis of capitalism was approaching in a couple of years' time. He wanted to be ready to inform the working class about what change needed to be in the post as we went from capitalism to socialism. And he went back and reread everything that he'd already read and took yet more copious notes, which became the Grundrisse. But in the middle of doing it, a colleague dropped in one of his own copies. Marx had lent out his own copy of the book. Miraculously, it came back at a later stage, and he reread Hegel at the time he was doing it. And this is quoting, I think, from, I've forgotten the author's name too early in the morning, but this is an author talking at the development of Marx's logic, saying it's an imperative to refer to a passage in Marx's letter to Engels of January, notice the date, January 14, 1858. So it's at 57, 58 were crucial years in Marx's thinking, written in the midst of writing the Grundrisse, in which he declares that in the method of treatment, the fact that here it was logic, the fact by a mere accident I have again glanced through Hegel's logic has been of great service to me. So having thrown away effectively the dialectical logic before, when he was going through writing the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, dropping the philosophical language, now it's coming back in again. And Mrs. Mandel, saying it's undeniable the extraordinary riches of Marx's analysis and the dialectical pairs commodity and money, use value and exchange value, which is the main one I'll talk about, etc., in which the Grundrisse abound, was if not directly caused and at least stimulated by the author's second encounter with his old mentor. Now, to me, it's clearly stimulated by that exposure, and you'll see that turning up if you read the Grundrisse. Has anybody ever read any work by Hunter S. Thompson? Okay. Gonzo journalism. If you know, and I don't know my drugs all that well, but if you know your drugs, you can virtually tell which particular influence Thompson is writing under the drug he's writing under the influence of at different stages in his various books. Marx, you can just see when the influence of Hegel kicks in. It's because he's not reading Hegel as part of his whole Grundrisse project. He's reading it on the side. So as he starts to write about the classical authors he's rereading again, this language starts to turn up. It just comes in organically in his own writing. Now, the essence was this dialectical focus on the classical theory of value. And here to put that together, to Marx, as he concluded the Grundrisse with this statement, the commodity is the essential unity in capitalism. Capitalism revolves around commodity production. And because it's a unity in this embedded in capitalist society, capitalism focuses upon one aspect of that, which of course is the exchange value. You're trying to maximise your exchange value. Use value, therefore, is cast into the background. So exchange value determines price, use value is irrelevant. But a commodity, and that formalises Ricardo's long-run production explanation for why cost of production has primacy. But both the foreground and the background are essential to the commodity's existence. There's a tension between use value and exchange value. And that becomes absolutely central to Marx's thinking after that stage. Now, as the Grundrisse is again a bit like the economic and philosophical manuscripts. It wasn't written to be published. It was his very copious notes. Now, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, I think, is about that thick. It's about 150, maybe 200 pages. Grundrisse is about 900 pages thick. Okay? It's a huge increase in detail. And that's even with very compressed print in the first Penguin edition. And, of course, there's no structure to it. It's just his own notes. So what happens on, I think it's on page 267 of the Penguin edition, there's a footnote. Now, that would have been something that he'd asterisked and underlined. Okay? That's how it would have been decided to make this a footnote rather than part of the overall argument. It's a 2-page long footnote. It extends over 2 pages, not 2 entire pages long, but it extends over 2 pages. And he starts with a statement, is not value to be conceived of the unity of use value and exchange value? This is him writing questions to himself. Okay? This is a serious insight he's just had. In and for itself is value the general form in opposition to use value and exchange values, particular forms of it. So value is the unity, exchange value and use value the foreground and background. Does this have significance in economics? Okay? It's a question to himself. Use value is presupposed even in simple exchange or barter, but here where exchange takes place only for the reciprocal use of the commodity, people are swapping because what you have is more useful to me than what I've got, okay? The natural particularity has no such standing as an economic form. So in this particular instance, use value isn't an economic thing, it's a qualitative decision. Its form rather is exchange value. So in this particular stage, simple barter, use value doesn't play any economic role. But he says, but does not this content as such develop into a system of needs and production? Does not use value as such enter into the form itself? For example, in the relation of capital and labour. If only exchange value plays a role in economics, and of course this is what Ricardo and Smith had all argued, that use value is irrelevant. Okay, they just focused upon exchange value. Now Marx is saying if only exchange value plays a role, then how do elements relating to use value turn up later? He says the price is merely a formal aspect of this. So this is a serious inspirational moment for Marx, but if he was sitting in the British Library writing this with great enthusiasm, this is not in the slightest contradicted by the fact that exchange value is a predominant aspect. That's the foreground and background thinking. But of course, so use does not come to a halt merely because it's determined by exchange. He said, in this, and on he goes, in this case, this is to be examined with exactitude, and not as Ricardo does, to be entirely abstracted upon, nor the dull say, who puffs himself up with a mere presupposition of the word utility. So above all, it will and must become clear to what extent use value exists not only as presupposed, so just as that precondition, but to what extent it enters into it, with use value as part of economics. And there's this final reference here. Proudhon's nonsense, see the misery. In other words, the philosophy of poverty. Okay? So he's come back to that starting point 13 years later. That's why that little throwaway line about Proudhon, the synthesis of use value and exchange value. Okay? And I think in some ways, maybe even though Proudhon got it totally wrong, maybe that little seed was sitting there and Marx had to come back to his dialectical thinking to really understand it. So what you find from this stage on that particular page in page 267 to 268 of the Penguin edition, you can get this online, by the way, now, not actually with the same pagination, but you'll find the whole thing online. I think I've got a link to it on one of the slides. So this dialectic between use value and exchange value becomes the fundamental way that Marx organises his thought from this stage on. Everything has to go through this particular prism. And he confirms this, by the way, and this is last year Mark made a comment about, why do you focus upon this particular book? This is such an early piece of work, and there's much more of this in Capital, etc., etc. Well, he actually got a chance to see how people interpreted Capital by reading a book by Adolf Wagner. And again, this is something which has turned up which wasn't supposed to be published. But he, in his copy of Wagner's, I think it's a critique of Marx, I'm not sure. Again, I've got to read Wagner completely one of these days. But he wrote notes in the margin of the book. I'm sure some of you have done that to library books. Anybody guilty here of that? Yeah, okay, righto. Hate you bastards. Don't mind notes in them. I hate people underlining stuff because I can't scan the book anymore. Okay, if you, I can handle the margins, don't scan, don't underline. Anyway, here he has in the margin, he's written all his notes on Wagner. And actually, and I'll come to that in a moment, and you'll just see how he says the use value and exchange value play an essential role in his thinking, and that's writing after he wrote Capital. But you find this blend now, which he didn't have beforehand. He went from having a dialectical way of thinking to reading the classical school and having a totally classical way of thinking. From this point on, the two are combined. So here we go. Again, this is the continue on the same quote, the same footnote. Exchange value and use value brought into relation. The one side, capital, stands opposite, the other is exchange value. The other labour stands opposite as use value. Which is effectively saying that what the capitalist wants the labour for is the use value of labour. Okay. He said, so we've seen earlier that it cannot be said that exchange value is realised in simple circulation, so you don't make a profit out of simple circulation. And that's, he says, because use value does not stand opposite exchange value. So unless you can exploit this gap between exchange value and use value, which doesn't happen in simple commodity exchange, you can't make a profit. So this is the beginning of a new explanation for where profit comes from. Okay. I'd be reading Marx all day if I kept on going. I'll let you take a look at those two yourselves. Okay. It must now be posited that use value becomes what it is through exchange value, and exchange value mediates itself through use value. So there's a role between the two. And this completely reorganises how Marx thinks about economics from this point on. And to give you that visual model again, we're now applying it to a commodity. Now what you have is capitalist society. The unity we're looking at is the commodity. In capitalism, the exchange value of the commodity is what capitalism focuses upon, which sets the price for the commodity. The use value, therefore, goes into the background. It's irrelevant to price, but there's a tension between the two. That's the basic organising concept. Make sense? Okay. You're going to see a lot of that circle analogy in this lecture. Pardon me. There we go. So if you look at that same idea, what can you see for Smith and Ricardo and also Marx himself in terms of how they think in that framework I'm now bringing forward? Well, exchange value is all they worried about. The commodity society being capitalist society focusing on commodity, yes. Exchange value, yes. They didn't have it all there. Exchange value was their only explanation for capitalism, and use value was just seen as a prerequisite. It was pretty much ignored. What you get with Marx is the combined number. And I think you see a dramatic improvement in how he can think about the classical way of doing economics from this concept. So it becomes absolutely crucial to how he understands capitalism, and it gives you a very, very different foundation to the neoclassicals, and it justifies what post-Keynesians do when they think about pricing, because they ignore the role of use value, effectively utility. We reject marginal cost and marginal utility mathematics as an explanation for the price of anything. Okay. This is a philosophical explanation and a practical explanation as to why that's justified. And Marx, again, I think this is, I'm not sure the book I'm taking this from, I think it might be the Theories of Surplus Value, but he gave a good historical and logical explanation as to why there would be a distinction between the two, why you would not have use value playing a role in setting price once you had a capitalist society developing. And he said, objects in themselves are external to man, so therefore you can alienate them. And of course there are some societies where that can't be done, okay? Where particular things can't be alienated. They're not external to society. He said, for that alienation to be reciprocal, it's only necessary for people, by a tacit understanding, to treat each other as private owners of those objects, and therefore independent individuals. He said, but such a state of reciprocal independence has no existence in a primitive society based on property in common. So if you're living in a tribal society, in a genuine tribal society, everything in a sense is collective. Okay? Not totally, obviously, but more of a sense of collective ownership of everything than individual rights as part of those societies. They said exchange, therefore, in terms of the type of barter exchange or commercial exchange that we focus upon, that will first occur on the boundaries between two societies. And he said, therefore, you have to work out how much do you exchange something for something else. Now, has anybody here read Clan of the Cave Bear? Okay, Clan of the Cave Bear? Okay. It's a series of books by a woman called Jean Auel, A-U-E-L, I think her name is. Do not read Volume 6. Okay, 6 is trash. But the first 4 in particular are very good archaeologically and anthropologically based fictions about a woman who was raised by Neanderthals and then interacts with a whole range of Cro-Magnon tribes in early mini-Ice Age Europe. about 10,000 years ago. And it's based on serious research. He's actually both done the research and funded a lot of research into the anthropology and the archaeology of these ancient societies, working out how societies evolved, clashes between them, how technology evolved, and so on. And she gives a lot of little examples of accidental ways that the technology was developed. So, for example, how do you think people first developed soap? Yeah. Pardon? Fat falling animal fat falling into charcoal. Okay, you're using wood to make a fire. You're cooking an animal. The animal fat falls onto the charcoal. A chemical reaction occurs between the charcoal and the fat, and part of it produces soap. Okay, that's an accident. But somebody had to make the first accident. How do you reckon you make white leather? Got all these, everybody's wearing leather clothing. You're killing animals to make your clothing before you start making knitting and darning. How do you make white leather?
You wet yourself.
Exactly, you piss on it. Okay. Now, people would not be exactly trying to do that on a regular basis, but if somebody first worked out that urine causes tanned leather to lose its colour and go white, you've now got the capacity to wear white clothing. Nobody else has. Okay. So there's various accidental discoveries, like the pottery, for example. How did you discover pottery? There were plenty of clay pots we know which were not fired, but again, a piece of clay would fall into the fireplace and fired. So all these accidental discoveries would occur, and they'd occur in different tribal groups. So the argument that Ayol makes, which is she puts all these inventions pretty much in the hand of one person, which is a bit extreme, but it's good fiction. But the idea would be that some different tribes learn how to do these different things, and then you have no idea how that's done. How does that tribe with white leather have white leather? How does that tribe with pottery jars that don't fragment and fall apart, how do they do that? You don't know. And initially they're making these things for their own use. So if you come across another tribe and the other tribe says, wow, that's really cool white gear you're wearing, how do you work out the exchange value? And actually to give somebody the white clothing, you've got to give away something you're using. Okay? So the use value of what you're giving away matters to the person involved on the selling side of the trade, which is part of neoclassical theory. And take a look at that whole idea of ratios of marginal utilities and marginal costs. It's still using a concept that the seller is losing some utility for giving away the object. Now Marx says once you do the first exchange, sure, that's fair enough. The use value will definitely affect the price in some way. But once it becomes done habitually, the tribe that can make white leather starts pissing on leather in secret as much as they can to produce the stuff for exchange, because they can't make the pots the other crowd can make. So you start to produce excess, not stuff you need for your own consumption. So a division starts to occur between the use value of something and the exchange value. So here's again Marx in more detail. The proportion in which exchange first occurs is a matter of chance. What makes it possible is people wish to alienate. So you want to give away something that has some utility to you for something you can't make, therefore has high utility for you, and any old price will apply at that stage. It says, as you start establishing the need for these foreign objects, so people expect to have pottery that doesn't break, they expect to have some white clothing, they expect to have soap, etc., that makes it a normal social act, and therefore some of what you produce is actually made for the sake of production. You're not producing it because of your own need for it now, not utility that's driving you, it's the need to exchange it. You say for that moment the distinction becomes firmly established between the utility of an object for its purposes of consumption and its utility for the purposes of exchange. Its use value becomes distinguished from its exchange value. That's actually in Capital. Okay, volume 1 of Capital. So there's a very rich historical and circumstantial explanation for this. Very, very different to the neoclassical thing, which still treats us like we're living in, primitive tribes exchanging stuff, giving away stuff we need, we get utility from, as if Henry Ford lost utility each time the Model T Ford went off the factory line. No, that's not capitalism. So he then goes back to the question of where does surplus come from? And now he's using a very, very different methodology to what he used with the original Ricardian arguments. It's no longer the unique properties of labour, which is the focus of that Ricardian explanation, it's the dialectics of use value and exchange value. it begins with a very powerful application of this dialectics. If equivalents are exchanged, then exchange value can't be the source of surplus value. And this is partly Ricardo's dilemma. If you sell and buy things at their value, then you're not going to make a profit out of the exchange value side of those commodities. Therefore, the dialectical opposite of value, which is use value, is the only possible source of surplus value. And here's Marx from the Capital again. The change of value that occurs must take place in the commodity bought by the first act. So you're paying money to buy a commodity, but not in its value, for equivalents or exchange. The commodity is paid for its full value. We are therefore forced to the conclusion that the change originates in the use value as such of the commodity, its consumption. Oh, bloody hell, I didn't turn my phone up, I'm getting a phone call. Hang on a second, better. Okay, sorry about that. I'll turn this thing off now. My apologies. Okay. So, to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags is a satirical character in parts of Volume 1 of Capital, must be so lucky as to find a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value. So now it's an explanation based on exchange value and use value. And by the way, I'm going to argue it's not peculiar at all. They said the past labour that's embodied in labour power and the living labour it can call into action, the daily cost of maintaining it and its daily expenditure work are two totally different things. This is the use value exchange value combination. The former determines the exchange value of labour power, the latter is its use value. Now, notice, and I'll come back to this particular phrase later, just to emphasise a point there. But notice they're both quantitative. Okay? They're both measured in either commodity terms or money terms. So this is quantitative use value. I'll come back and emphasise that in a moment. So the fact that half a working day is necessary to keep a labourer alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent him working the whole day. See? Therefore, the value of labour power and the value it creates are two entirely different magnitudes. Okay? Again, I'm going to emphasise this as Marx's own language, not something I'm imposing on there. This difference in the two values is what the capitalist had in view when he's purchasing the labour power. Now, this is a punchline here. The useful quantities were nothing more than a condition sine qua non. It's a necessity that the labour is useful, but that's irrelevant. That's not the use value that the capitalist is focusing upon here. What really influences with specific use value of being a source not only of value, but more of value than it has itself. Now again he continues, and then notice how the previous explanation and the Ricardian one was the unique characteristics of labour versus labour power. There's no other commodity. You can talk about commodity versus commodity power. Here he's saying it's something which applies to all commodities. In this transaction he acts in accordance with the eternal laws of the exchange of commodities. The seller of labour power, like the seller of any other commodity, realises its exchange value and parts with its use value. So he's now deriving the source of value, the source of profit, not from something which is unique to labour, but a characteristic labour shares in common with all other commodities. And that's a huge shift in the way he talks about economics and capitalism in general. The change in this change is a major change that most Marxists fail to see. And in some ways I'm not worried about that. I want post-Keynesians to see it and make use of it. Actually, we've now got to the hour mark in the lecture, so I might take a break there. Let that sink in for about 10 minutes and come back. Let's keep rolling on this whole topic of use value. And one thing, when I did my master's thesis on this topic, this is what you're getting as research. I did for my own master's, a research master, which is 2 years long, by the way. So I put a bit more work into my thesis than I expect you guys to do. But in reading it, I read Paul Sweezy. And Paul Sweezy writes at one stage, writing, I think this is in the Theory of Capitalist Development, I'm not sure. Here's this comedy who says, every commodity, Marx wrote, has a twofold aspect, that of use value and exchange value. In possessing a use value, commodity is in no way peculiar. Object of consumption in every age and society possess use value. It said, use value is the expression of a relation between the consumer and the object consumed. It said, political economy, on the other hand, is the social science of the relations between people. He then concludes it follows that use value as such lies outside the sphere of investigation of political economy. Okay? Don't bother about it. Now, I read that and I knew it was bullshit at the time I read it. Okay? So, I didn't need to read Rostalski to know this, but I was pleased to find later that a book called The Making of Marx's Capital by Rostalski, a Polish philosopher, pointed out the same argument. Sweezy left out a qualifying sentence at that stage without using little ... to show I'm leaving something out of the quote, where he did use ... early up to leave out a trivial thing. He didn't put ... at this, and I wrote to Sweezy and had a bit of a fight with him over it a long time ago. Okay, what Rostalski wrote was comments that among Marx's numerous critical comments on Ricardo, the most striking to be found only in the rough draft of the Grundrisse, that Ricardo abstracts from use value. So here is Rostalski pointing out that Marx criticises Ricardo for ignoring use value, when Marxists say that Marx ignored use value. He said, and consequently relies as a simple perceived proposition. He says, strangely enough, not only Ricardo but many of Marx's pupils, it's been a tradition to disregard it and place it under the scope of knowledge of merchandise. And now here's the quote that Marx actually said, and the sentence in red is the one that Sweezy left out. To be a use value is a necessary prerequisite, and the use value as such lies outside the sphere of investigation of political economy. It belongs in this sphere only when it is itself a determinate form. Now that's leaving out a pretty crucial sentence. It's basically distorting Marx to leave that statement out. And that's what Sweezy did, and it's common amongst Marxists to ignore that. But most amusing is one of the book by Adolf Wagner that he wrote these notes on in the margin of the book. And this is a wonderful one to say just how essential this logic is to Marx. He says, secondly, only an obscurantist who's not understood a word of capital, okay, which is rather a put-down, can conclude that because Marx in the first edition, which is the critique of political economy, in fact, overthrows all the German professorial twaddle on use value and refers users to look at commercial guides, it's therefore use value plays no role in his work. He said, the obscurantist has overlooked that my analysis of the commodity presents the dual characteristic of labour, whose product is use value, expenditure of labour, power, etc., etc., that surplus value itself is derived from a specific use value of labour. Finding that hence with me use value plays an important role completely different than in previous political economy. So he's saying it's absolutely central to his thinking. And he said, but it's not just quibbling about it in the way that Say did, it's actually where use value plays a legitimate role in capitalism. So it's Marx emphasising after he wrote Capital that this is the fulcrum of how he thinks about the economy these days. And to leave it out means you're ignoring an essential part of Marx's logic. Now, you know about the idea of the two circuits in capitalism. Have you heard that expression? Marx talks about commodity to money to commodity, where you can't make a profit, but money to commodity to more money, where you can make a profit. And in the ends, which of course one you can see is what workers do, the other you can see is what capitalists do in various ways. But in this money, commodity, more money circuit, use value is quantitative. And this is a huge difference to the neoclassical school as well. Let's go back to this passage here. We've got the past labour that is embodied in labour power. And this is where Marx explains surplus, by the way, in Volume 1 of Capital. The past labour embodied in labour power and the living labour it can call into action, the daily cost of maintaining it and its daily expenditure are two totally different things. The former determines the exchange value, the latter is its use value. What determines the exchange value is the past labour, that's the means of subsistence. The use value is the work it can do. And with the idea that there's a distinction between the two and a gap between the two, that's where Marx explains surplus coming from, or profit. He said the specific use value this commodity has of being not only a source of value, but more value than it has itself. Now that's quantitative. And this is the one thing I find a lot of Marxists, again, have a hard time getting their heads around. When Marx is talking in the CMC circuitry, commodity to money to commodity, then the use value is qualitative. Okay? You're changing from one commodity to another without making a profit, where the commodity you purchase gives you more utility than the one you had beforehand. He's quite happy to say that. Yeah.
I've definitely read in something, I don't know whether it's bolded, that use value is qualitative and it doesn't, it's not quantitative, and Now,
Yeah.
obviously you're taking quotes here from Marx, which support your argument that,
Yeah.
that you're going to develop. But presumably there are other quotes of Marx where he says it is qualitative.
Yeah. But he's saying it's qualitative in a particular circuit. And he does say at various times that it's quantitative, that it's got a magnitude. And I'm coming up to those quotes as well. Now, something can't have a you can't say something is really, really fantastic 24 inches. Okay? I'm not going to go anywhere with potential jokes on that front, but it's a qualitative. Qualitative and quantitative are two different things. If you say something's has a magnitude, you're saying it's quantitative. And I'll show you that phrase in a moment.
What I'm saying is that there could be a lot of quotes from Marx.
There are.
It says it's qualitative.
Oh yeah, that's right. But if you take a look at them, they're all in the case of where he's talking about the CMC circuit, not the MCM plus circuit.
Right.
Misidentifying. So when he's talking about the MCM plus circuit, he's saying it's quantitative. The value of labour power and the use value are two entirely different, and I'm emphasising the word, this is Marx's word, magnitudes. Okay? The value of labour power and the value it creates, and I've injected use value and exchange value inside, they're two entirely different magnitudes. And this difference in the two values is what the value capitalist had in view when he's purchasing labour power. So you get these qualitative aspects being discussed, and this is again going back to that comment beforehand, that unless the labour does something useful, then it's not going to create any profit for the capitalist. So it has to be useful in that sense. But that's secondary to it having a quantitative value. So, and this is my favourite quote. This is from Capital. Okay, so it's, again, people say, like, I'm looking at obscure works by Marx. Nothing obscure about Volume 1 of Capital. And this is saying exchange value and use value being intrinsically incommensurable magnitudes. Okay, so this is something Marxists and Foley included haven't got their head around. When Marx is talking about use value, exchange value in the MCM plus circuit, which is where he explains profit from, and surplus, of course, then he has them as magnitudes. Okay. Yes, it has to be useful labour, qualitatively useful, but that's not why the capitalist hires it. He doesn't hire a shoemaker because the guy makes really neat shoes. He hires shoemakers because he can sell the shoes for a profit. So the use value that matters to the purchaser in that case, that's Marx's orientation. The value, your valuation you put on the use value of something, comes from the purchaser.
Doesn't incommensurable mean that they're magnitudes that are sort of different and not commensurable? They're not. You can't compare them. That incommensurable means they're different. Okay, but incommensurable magnitudes mean they're comparable. They're both magnitudes. What he's saying is one is not the same as the other. Doesn't incommensurable mean you can't measure them in both the same measure?
Incommensurable does mean that word, okay, that's sure, but when you say incommensurable magnitudes, how can you make sense of that? You either say Marx is losing it, or Marx has got a very deep point here. Now his point by incommensurability, what he means is exchange value and use value have no relation to each other. Starting from his initial abstract point of view, the exchange value and the use value have been separated, they're distinguished from each other. He's using the word, I don't know whether this is actually, of course, translated from the German. I don't know what the original German word was, so that might be interesting for our German readers to let us know next week. Possible? It's a particular page. It's good to go to a particular page in Capital. The German, do you have a German copy or access to a German? Search and find and see what word he used there. They'd be intriguing to find out. But exchange value and use value first of all, the starting point he has is that they're independent from each other. One plays no relation to determining the other. That's what he means by incommensurable there. But he's saying they're both magnitudes. Now, it's a general concept applied in a specific position. So if you have use value and exchange value in the CMC circuit, he's saying they're incommensurable qualities. Okay? One doesn't determine the other. When you're looking in MCM plus, they're incommensurable magnitudes. One won't determine the other, but there'll be a gap between the two. Keep on.
I think what it means is this is measured in inches and this is measured in coulombs, and then you can't. There's no.
No, but if that was the case,
say 6 inches is 4 coulombs.
If he did that, you couldn't say that there's a surplus produced either. You couldn't explain profit. Okay, he's using this to explain profit. So the nature of the use, though, will come. That's a good point to finish that conversation on, because we will see that turning up shortly. He does compare them both in terms of hours of labour. Okay.
So they are commensurable.
Yeah, that's right. It's what he means by the incommensurability is the separation of use value and exchange value. Not that they can't be compared when they're both quantitative. Okay. So the nature depends upon the circuit, and this again is where I think a lot of Marxists get confused. And I think there's a reason they want to get confused, because if you think there's logic through, you abolish the Labour theory of value, which is not what most Marxists want to do. So the CMC circuit, yes, they're qualitative, and one's qualitative, the other's quantitative. You can't compare them. They're genuinely incommensurable in that case. And there's no real economic role for them. But the MCM plus circuit, use value is quantitative, and it plays an essential role, which is explaining what the source of surplus value is, as he applies it to the quantity of labour power. So his explanation starts this way. You have the MCM plus circuit. Labour is a commodity in that circuit. The foreground, the capitalism focuses upon the foreground aspect, which is the exchange value, and therefore that's what determines the cost of labour power, the subsistence wage. The background is its capability to produce commodities for sale. That's why the capitalist hires the worker in the first place. And the dialectical tension between the two is that makes it a potential source of surplus value. That's the logic now Marx is now using, which is based on the general characteristics of commodities, very, very different to the argument he had initially about the specific, unique features of labour power. So it's a very, very big shift. And most Marxists go from one to the other without realising there's a shift. They don't want to have the shift, in fact. Now, what you look at is this quantitative use value. The value of the new product concludes the equivalent of the value of the labour power, that's the exchange value, together with a surplus value, that comes from the gap between the exchange value and the use value. This is so because the value of labour power is less than the value created by its use during that time, but the worker has been paid his exchange value. And he said this is what happens in every commercial exchange. There's nothing unique in this sense about the labour exchange. Anybody who sells a commodity parts with its use value and receives in return its exchange value. And again, Marx emphasises this point. That's when, in that first slide, when I had exploitation of labour power as a source of profit, I had it in inverted commas, because Marx emphasises there's nothing unique about how labour is being treated here. The fact that this particular commodity, because it possesses the peculiar use value of supplying labour and therefore of creating value, cannot affect the general law of commodity production. So if therefore the value advanced in wages is augmented by a surplus value, this is not because the seller's been defrauded. So there's no way in which the worker's being treated badly, and this has been treated in capitalism, where everything else is. He's received the value of his commodity. It is due solely to this fact that the commodity's been used up by the buyer. That's where the surplus comes from. So there's no sense of exploitation in that political sense here. The law of value requires equality between the exchange values of the commodities given in exchange for one another. From the very outset, it presupposes a difference between the use values. Now, this is the qualitative thing in one circuit, but it's quantitative in the MCM plus. He said, so now I thought this was brilliant. When I first saw this, I was in a Marxism reading group in 1973/4, which is summer in Sydney, of course. I was spending my time inside a philosophy room rather than out in the sunshine in Sydney. A bunch of lefties, as you can imagine. And reading Capital for the first time after we'd led the student revolt in 73 over the philosophical aspects of feminist thought in the philosophy department and political economy at Sydney University. And I was reading this book and I'm thinking, well, I accept a lot of Marx's logic, but I can't swallow this idea that capital doesn't provide value. I wanted a good explanation of that. And in reading it, I found this use value, exchange value stuff, which I thought was fantastic. I thought that here's a contrast to the marginal cost, marginal utility stuff of the neoclassicals that make perfect sense to me. That historically I can explain why it came about, that lets you treat the neoclassical thing as befitting analysis of a couple of tribes in New Guinea exchanging with each other, having met for the very first time, not capitalist production when you've got Ford and Chrysler and IBM producing enormous numbers of commodities for sale. Very realistic, but to me it contradicted the argument that machinery produced no value, because if you play the same logic, what's the use value of a machine? First of all, shouldn't that differ from its exchange value? And therefore shouldn't commodity inputs in general be a source of surplus value, not just labour? Now, Marx and co. argued otherwise, but when you look at the logic, the exchange value of a machine is the cost of production. Same as for the exchange value of a worker, cost of production. One is means of subsistence, the other's material inputs, but similar in that sense. The use value of a machine, it can produce commodities for sale. As with the worker, there'll be a gap between the two. Now, to reach the conclusion that machinery can't produce value, Marx has to say that in the case of machines, the exchange value and the use value are identical. Not incommensurable, but identical to each other. And that's what he ends up doing in a range of verbal logic, which is not logic at all, but obfuscation. And I'll take you through that in detail in this part of the lecture. So that contradicts the later theory of value. It argues that all inputs to production are potentially sources of profits. And fundamentally, when you think about what's the cost of the exchange value of a machine, is its depreciation. Okay? But its contribution to output is not its depreciation. It can be different to its depreciation. So Marx ends up doing is identifying the machine's contribution to production with its depreciation. And you'll see that turning up. Now, he first realised that when he developed the dialectic. And this is in those early passages in the rough notes. Again, having had a very vigorous argument with Anwar Sheikh one day, he argued this is all about technological change. I argued garbage, it's about the general concept. But he's talking about, when he first asked to apply this concept of use value and exchange value and a dialectic between them to capital, he says it also has to be postulated that the use value of the machine significantly greater than its value. I.e., and this is the point, that its devaluation of service production is not proportional to its increasing effect upon production. So Marx is actually contemplating exactly what I'm talking about here, that the depreciation is the exchange value, the contribution to production is the use value, a gap between the two so a machine can add to surplus value. Yeah?
We could be considered as being machines.
Pardon?
Human beings could be considered as being machines and you get the equivalence.
Yeah.
Say, both can be surplus. But what a machine can't do is alienate something, which we can.
Yeah, we wouldn't have capitalism if we didn't have humanity. Okay, but I'm saying capitalism and the fact we can produce a surplus level of output, surplus commodities, isn't explained only by labour. In that sense, it comes back to the thermodynamic argument. It says, what are we fundamentally doing? We're harnessing free energy. Now, are human beings the only things that can harness free energy? Well, frankly, no, because cows can do the same thing. Or horses can do the same thing. And this is actually, Smith made this point at one stage, saying that the farmer, his labouring cattle are workers in that sense.
But Marx's point is that when the combustion engine came along, all horses went.
Yeah.
But there are still human workers around.
Oh, yeah.
Because human workers are different from machines. Because it's a social, it's not just about energy, it's also about social position of a system of producing social hierarchy, and therefore it's not just about energy.
No, it's not just about energy.
If
not
it's
just
energy, then it's like that 1920s Czech drama of the robots. I don't know what it's called now. Where human beings just collapse. The word for robot is the Slavic word for worker. And you just see a worker as a machine there, completely useful. We're all just machines. And, you have this reductionist approach where, yes, when you take that, yes, both can produce surplus value.
Well, that's what Marx elaborates beyond that view, which is what I want to get to say humans are different, and in fact it results in workers getting more than their value. Okay?
Yeah, we in line with a specific standard of life that is being approached.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, where does the concept of embodied labour fit in?
Of which?
Of embodied labour?
Embodied labour. Embodied versus, well, that's talking about the difference between subsistence and capacity to work. Okay, so labour embodied and labour commanded. This is, in a sense, that's more Ricardo than it is Marx, but they're both turning up here.
Could you not argue that the machine is still produced by human labour, and therefore the machine creates kind of surplus, like through the human labour that was put in?
Yeah, you can make all those sorts of arguments. They all have to end up including that the use value and the exchange value of the machine are identical. Okay? Because now, you see, what you've gone is there's a real flip going on here in Marx. So initially, he said there's these unique characteristics of machine of labour that explain why it is a producer surplus and nothing else is. Okay, on that basis, what you've got to say is, well, there's got to be something unique about machinery as well that matches what you're saying is unique about labour, and you can't do it. Okay, without the use value, exchange value logic, yes, you're stuck with saying the derivation we can say is labour produces surplus value. When you get to this use value, exchange value stuff, then if you're going to explain that the machine adds no value, you have to explain it in terms of use value and exchange value terms in general. Now, Marx argues, this is word incommensurable we were debating earlier. Marx says the use value and the exchange value are different to each other. Now, if you're going to say the machine adds no surplus, you've got to say the use value in the machine is identical to its exchange value. Okay? Now, to do that, you've got to contradict Marx's underlying logic that they're different. And that's the real point I'm coming down to here. Yeah?
Did you not say the use value of the machine is greater than the exchange value? That someone put that use value in that machine, and that was the labour that made that machine, and the intellectual property in the design of that machine and all that sort of thing. So I mean, it's kind of like the use value. Yes, the use value of that machine is greater than the exchange value, but just like a labourer working 6 hours and 12 hours and all that, putting extra the labour he puts in, but when he makes the machine, the labour that he puts in then kind of lives on in the machine. And
we're talking the labour of Edison there rather than the labour of the people who install the light bulbs. So, we're becoming rather esoteric. And I agree, you've got to say that intelligent creativity is what generates the machines we use and gives us this capability to exploit the energy we find and to transform matter in ways we never imagined 20 years earlier. That's all part of how we have to think about capitalism. But Marx's point here is, where can profit come from? Where does surplus output come from? Where do surplus commodities originate? And he's straight at the production process level. His original argument was it only comes out of labour. I'm saying his argument now logically leads to comes out of any input to production, which is consistent with the laws of thermodynamics in a way that the labour theory value is not. Okay? And which leads to different implications about the nature of capitalism as well. Yeah.
He's not saying that the machine creates value.
He's saying, he says it here. That particular phrase I've got on the board immediately says it. Its devaluation in the service of production is not proportional to its increasing effect upon production. So in this particular phrase, Marx is actually saying the machine can create more value in out production than it loses. Yeah.
There's that, like a few people in machines and humans, and it's pointed out by Dialectics, that is in a contract, you cannot specify what the human effort exactly must be. Humans can work happier, and this could affect productivity in the whole industry, and this is something we can
this is also
in a machine and not in a human.
Yeah, that's okay, but that does not explain why machines don't produce surplus. And again, to get to Marx's logic, is saying if you actually want to explain why machines don't produce surplus now, you've got to use this use value, exchange value logic and be true to it to derive that conclusion. That's a logical point here.
Machines are make work more productive, but machines by themselves, they cannot produce anything.
I can say exactly the same thing about humans.
With energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of whether the machine is adding more capability to exploit energy than we can do on our own. Whether the work we put into making the shovel, and therefore using the shovel to dig holes, increases the amount of effective energy we can apply than if we dig with our bare hands. Now, effectively what the labour theory of value is saying, where it says it's just the labour, really says is we're no better off than digging with our bare hands in terms of the amount of energy we can exploit, which is totally wrong. And I want to hang on to Marx's logic and build on that. Let's go a couple of slides further.
If Marx is saying, like, at the end of the time, work is the amount of labor, the amount of I can't remember the site, but he did something like muscle and nerves and the amount of work that humans produce while they're working, and but abstract form of labor that constitutes the exchange value. It's the same for everybody. So what I understand here is of course machines make more productive labor, but at the end of the time, if someone spends 8 hours of their journey working, it's going to be the same, but because they are using a more productive machinery, they are going to produce more.
Yeah, again, this is all the sort of stuff which you'll find in lots and lots of Marxist literature. Okay, all trying to explain why labour is the only source of value and profit. Okay, you can drag all that sort of stuff inside here. What I'm saying is to actually reach that conclusion within Marx's own logic, you've got to prove that the use value of the machine is identical to its exchange value. When you're starting from a general concept saying use value and exchange value are incommensurable. Okay? So you can reach those conclusions, but you end up logically contradicting Marx's own philosophy. And that's what Marxists have done, and what Marx himself did, because he didn't like the conclusion he was reaching through this logic.
If I'm a labourer in a field, right, I am selling my labour for its exchange value, but I'm giving away its use value, and the farmer gets the produce or whatever. If I'm a brilliant inventor of some machine which has productive capability, in just the same way, I'm selling my product for its exchange value, but its use value is higher than its exchange value, right? So just like when I'm selling my labour to dig a field, I'm selling it for I'm selling something where the use value is higher than the exchange value. If I create a machine, I'm also selling something where the use value is higher than its exchange value. Right?
So that's the point I'm making. You're going to the stage of the inventor doing it in the very first instance. I'm saying each instance of the machine as well. We'll come to all those points further on. But this is the... Yeah?
I just want to ask, so this whole point is just to explain that what creates the surplus value is the gap between the use value.
Yeah, that's right.
And what explains the gap is the exploitation force. Is that
not so much just the nature of exchange in capitalism. This is the whole idea of the dialectic of the commodity, that we have use value and exchange value as the two aspects of the commodity. We live in a capitalist society, so capitalism focuses upon the exchange value.
No, I think that's what that was. There was so much emphasis about labour exploitation, this whole political aspect of it. Was that not originally part of the view that he was trying to make? Or that
he was trying to make that point, and I'm saying his own logic undermined him, but he stuck with it because it led to the political conclusions Marx wanted to reach. So I reckon Marx actually shot him. What he's ended up doing is crippling, I reckon, the last 1.5 centuries of the labour movement with this particular myth. But let's cover a bit more detail here, and we'll get there, I hope. So go back to the Grundrisse, because this is where Marx really is talking about how this is a huge advance in his thinking. And he says this whole idea of the primacy of the cost of production over utility in setting price was a huge step that he thought he'd finally find a good philosophical explanation for it. And the dialectic was the first element of this, the central core of it. And the first thing he had to do with that was to explain what's the opposite of capital. So again, this becomes very heavy philosophical language, but here is Marx talking about it. The only utility an object can have for capital is to preserve or increase it. So this comes back to the quantitative idea. The motive to accumulate is inherent. Value insists on preserving itself through increase. And therefore, the only use value which can stand opposite capital as such is that which increases, multiplies, and preserves it. Okay? Then he says the opposite of capital cannot be a particular commodity, for as such it would form no opposition to capital, since the substance of capital is itself use value. It is not this commodity or that commodity, but all commodities. Okay? Not just labour. Now what does he do? In the very next line he brings in labour. He says, the communal stuff of all substance is that they're objectified labour. That's one quote leads directly onto the other. Marx is trying to make them consistent. But he's actually said it can't be all commodity. It can't be one commodity. It's got to be all commodities. And then what are all commodities? Oh, they're all labour. No, I'm sorry. Your logical step doesn't let you get there. It's all commodities. You can't rule out machinery. So he's saying, rather than saying the opposite can't be a particular commodity, he then says it is one commodity, which is labour. So he's caught with a logical conundrum. between those two. And throughout, what you'll find is that when he applies this use value, exchange value to looking at labour, he applies it very clearly, very accurately, and very cogently. When he applies it to machinery, it's a mess. It's a verbal mess. He's trying to make the two consistent when they contradict each other.
Is that because he's trying to resist going back to a classical notion of labour value as the difficulty you have to experience to go and get a kind of inconvenience? He doesn't want to go there because he has to maintain that. If he applies it equally to machines and people, he'll be forced to re-establish that distinction in a second place. He'll be forced to say, you can't put a machine through difficulty or trouble.
Pardon?
You can with a person.
Coming again? So that you can't...
I'm saying he has to state the difference, otherwise he just collapses back into the classical view, whereby value is derived from the difficulty I have to go to get something.
And I think that's something fundamentally what he does reach. And it's actually correct.
He doesn't fall back into that.
He doesn't want to fall, but he should. Because fundamentally that's the distinction between the neoclassical and the classical view. The neoclassical view sees it as being about utility. The classical is about effort. The classical school restricted effort to labour alone. Marx has now effectively generalised it to all inputs, but he's resisting that conclusion because he wants labour to be the only input that produces value. Because without that, he doesn't get the declining rate of profit, he doesn't get the collapse into socialism. Yeah. Yeah?
I would also agree with that, even not all value comes from labour.
Yeah.
But I think Marx just solves the problem by just reducing everything to labour. Like he would say, the unit of valuation uses is labour.
Yeah.
And so even the value of machine and input is expressed in terms of...
Do you know the academic called Aaron Bose? Okay, have a look. I'd recommend that for you specifically with that comment, because Aaron Bose wrote a beautiful paper where he makes exactly that point, but he makes it in the context of Schraffer's arguments about the reduction of commodities to dated labour. And if you do that reduction to dated labour, you always have a commodity residual. Okay? You cannot get rid of the commodity residual. The only way you can get rid of a commodity residual, and say by reducing things to dated labour, we have ultimately labour and nothing else, is to say that people can produce things using magic. Okay?
Can you spell the second one, please?
Pardon?
Can you spell the second one?
The second technique. What is the idea? This reference.
That's the last name of the
Pardon?
author.
B-O-S-E.
B-O-S-E. His first name is Aaron, A-R-U-N, and the second name is Bose, B-O-S. It's called Marx's Capital Axioms, and it's another attempt to disprove the labour theory of value. I think it's quite consistent with the approach that I take, but works on the whole idea of dated labour, and makes the point that if only labour is a source of profit, then ultimately the dated labour thing has to reach the stage where you say you can produce everything using just labour, which you can't. There's always going to be a commodity residual. So it's a different focus to what Schraffer takes on the same argument about using dated labour to measure. Yeah.
And don't you think that this technical way of understanding the surplus, the creation of surplus value, undermine the exploitative theory of Marx?
Yes, it does. Yep. Okay. We need a richer theory than that. Pardon?
It's overrated.
Pardon?
So it was all of this time overrated.
Yeah, it's overrated, and it's why Marxists didn't provide the major insights into capitalism's crises when they finally happened. Okay, they're still trying to solve an insoluble problem, which is the labour theory of value. So, but
some of them.
Yeah, some of them. There are some different...
A particular branch.
Yeah, particularly the Andrew Kleiman mob. Yeah. But I'm trying to say there's actually a foundation for post-Keynesian economics and what I'm building up here. And of course I'm leading to Minsky. Okay? Very long path to get, but I wanted to show the full foundation of actually getting there. What you'll find is, and it's because now you've got a really, really clear logical concept: use value, exchange value, dialectical tension, difference between the two. Okay? Very, very clear. Applied very clearly to labour. It's a mess when he applies it to machinery to reach the conclusion that there's no difference. And then I want to elaborate on that one, saying there is a difference and where you can get to. So what you have is a switch from this idea of the unique characteristics of labour, the labour power argument, to the common elements that labour shares with all other commodities. And here's, again, the frequency with which Marx emphasises this when he's talking about labour. The worker sells his commodity, which has a use value and also a price like all other commodities. For a specific sum of exchange values which capital concedes to him, the capitalist obtains labour the force which multiplies capital, etc., etc. Very, very clear statement of the proposition, now in this use value, exchange value terms. And this, again, the question is which circuit is he applying it to? If it's CMC, your use value is going to be qualitative. MCM plus, it's going to be quantitative, and that turns up all the time. So simple circulation, you're going from a commodity to money to a different commodity. The sole object is to increase your utility. Marx has no problem with accepting that's why people get involved in exchange. This is a direct quote. So far as regards use values, it is clear that both parties may gain some advantage. So people who argue Marx, again, the neoclassicals often say Marx doesn't include use value properly. Yes, he does, but in a different framework. In the circuit of capital, you're going from money to commodity to more money, and the sole object is to increase exchange value, but it has to involve the exchange of equivalents. So the cost of the production in that case, the exchange value, can't be the source of value. Therefore, use value plays an essential role. And here, again, is Marx talking about these two. In simple exchange, this double process does not take place. Okay? Commodity A is exchanged for money B, then commodity C. The using of the commodity is purely a physical interest, so you can ignore utility in that particular circuit. That's outside economics, but he says here, by contrast, when he's talking about producing surplus value, the use value that was exchanged for money is a particular economic relation. So, therefore, there's a distinction between the exchange of capital and labour and simple exchanges. Okay? They're two entirely different processes. So he's a very, very different treatment for MCM over CMC plus. Sorry, MCM plus. Okay. So that particular statement again, but in a different passage. So far as regards use values, both parties gain some advantage. Both part with goods that as use values are of no service to them. And that's again difference. The neoclassical thing argues the Henry Ford loses a bit of utility with each Model T Ford that came off the production line, which is nonsense. He said that they lose something which is no service to them, receive others they can make uses of them. So there's good grounds for saying exchange is a transaction by which both parties gain. So again, Marx is richer than the neoclassicals like to put him down as. It's otherwise with exchange value. There's no increase in exchange value. They already possessed a value equal to what they acquired. So they sell something worth $100, they get something else back also worth $100, similar cost of production. So again, this whole use value, exchange value logic, again, very, very different to what you see back in pre-1857. The commodity presents as a complex of two things, use value and exchange value. He said labour also has a twofold process. He said, I was the first to point out this critical twofold nature of labour economic commodities. He said, as this is the point on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns. Let's go into more detail. Now, you can see two elements to that. You can see it being the two natures, labour commanded and labour embodied, that sort of thing, or you can see it as use value and exchange value. So there's some points where I've got to argue, I think use value is exchange value is the primacy that Marx saw, and he saw no distinction between the two, whereas I think there is. So he's saying you must exchange profit on the basis of exchange of equivalence, and this is an extremely important passage when people try to use value and exchange value and reach different conclusions. The conversion of money into capital has to be explained on the basis of the laws that regulate the exchange of commodities, which start from the exchange of equivalence. Okay? Our friend moneybags must buy commodities at their value and sell them at their value and yet make a profit. Okay. Now, when he applies it to labour, absolutely sound, quite straightforward. So he says the basic idea is here's your MCM plus circuit. There's machinery. The foreground is the price. The background ability to produce commodities. Tension between the two. You can produce a surplus. There's no reason to reach any other conclusion with that logic. And again, it's a quantitative thing like it is with labour. And from a thermodynamic point of view, a machine's another way of harnessing free energy once you've set it up, once you've invented it. Now, to produce the opposite result, there's massive amounts of verbal gymnastics, which wasn't necessary when he talked about labour versus labour power, because you just say, well, there's no such distinction with machinery, therefore machinery can't produce a profit. So with that original explanation, he didn't have any problem in explaining capital. But when he's got this exchange value, use value thing, then he has to derive why machines don't produce a surplus, which is an essential part of the labour theory of value, from the general characteristics of commodities, which he can't do. But he did enough hand-waving and verbal shouting to confuse the very few who are actually aware that he used a dialectic in the first place. So he starts from a statement like this: the means of production transfer their value to the product only so far as, along with their use value, they also lose their exchange value. Now the same thing applies to a worker. If you have a worker down in a coal mine and they work themselves to the ground, exhausting their exchange value in the process, they exhaust their use value as well. Which one is the capitalist harnessing? Why has the capitalist hired them? He said if we consider an instrument of labour, a machine, from its day in entry to the workshop until it goes to the lumber room, its use value has been completely consumed, which is true, and therefore its exchange value completely transferred to the product, which is also true, but are they the same? Now what he tries to argue is they're identical, but his logic says they're different. So exchange value is transferred as part of the cost of production. If you look at the working out the cost of producing a machine, you're going to include the labour that went into it and the depreciation of the machine as part of the cost of production. Your profit comes out of the use value of both those elements. Okay. Now, Marx stuffs this up, and quite deliberately. He said, it is known by experience how long a machine will last. Suppose it lasts only 6 days, then each day it loses 1/6 of its use value. Okay. And then parts with 1/6 of its value. When he uses value without using a word before it, he normally means exchange value. Okay. So he's saying they both get transferred. What he has to prove is they're both equal to each other. He said it's that strikingly clear the means of production never transfer more value than they lose themselves during the labour process by the destruction of their own use value. So he's equating the exchange value and the use value here, which contradicts his own logic. You can see it's being correct in some ways. I think looking back at it now that it's actually doing a confusion of the truth, so it's not correct. But he's doing this turgid combination of exchange value and use value at all times. They lose in the labour process the original form, only to assume in the product the form of a new use value. Well, that's actually talking about the transmogrification of one utility into another utility. That's metaphysical. Okay? Yeah. This is in, that'd be about chapter 6, I think, or chapter 7. It's page 197 of the Progress Press edition, so we can actually search and find that. Okay.
The other citation was on Mundris.
Oh, there's all. I'm taking citations from a whole range of works here.
It says like capital produce or
depreciate. That was in the Grundrisse. Yeah, and that's the very, very first application of Marx's logic was in the Grundrisse. So I think in many ways you find the unadulterated reaction to it, and then you can see him going through that same shock reaction. Oh my God, what does this mean for the labour theory of value? And I think before he actually says anything like that, he tries to work out a way of making the two combine. I think I'll put that shade down for your benefit. Just a bit. Wrong one. Where's it coming from? Over here? It'll be reflecting off the floor. Hang on. Wow. I like it because it's a first in London. I've got to shut the shades because it's too much sunshine outside, interfering with the lecture.
The trains will stop soon.
The trains will stop, obviously. Okay, the lecture might stop in a short moment as well. We'll just get past this part. And I've got more to go to, and I'd rather go through during the tutorial time and finish this material if we can today than carry on. So this is where he starts to do this straight contradiction. However useful the machine is, though it may cost £150, it cannot, under any circumstances, add more than £150 to the value. What he's saying effectively is the use value is identical to the exchange value. And here he's now dismissing the importance of use value in the MCM plus circuit. In the later process, it only serves as a mere use value and could not, therefore, transfer any value to the product unless it possessed such value previously. He's contradicting his own logic and fooling 1.5 centuries of Marxists in the process. Let's carry on from there. Another 5 or 10 minute break and come back and we'll try to knock it off in the tutorial section. Okay. Thank for the door. Okay. Now, so this comment that Marx comes down to saying, and this is consistent with the original argument about labour versus labour power, but not with the use value, exchange value logic, saying the maximum value can lose is limited by the labour time necessary for its production, which is its depreciation. Okay? That's the maximum loss of value. You can't depreciate by more than your cost, your value in the first instance. But is that the limit to production? It's use value. Now here he goes, this mere use value stuff. It's the mere use value, which contradicts the logic he's just previously used to derive why you get surplus out of labour, because it's a mere use value too. So you get this contradictory logic all the way through. He says what is really consumed is their use value. That results in the product. There's no consumption of their value. So he said that which is produced is a new use value in which the old exchange value reappears. Now, there's sense in that and there's nonsense at the same time. Because what he's arguing effectively throughout is equating the use value of the machine to its exchange value. And that's the logical error he's making with the new form of logic he's using to derive why labour produces a surplus in the first instance. So, and here he's again making the same assertion. That's what he calls, the reason he uses C for capital, he calls it constant, and V for labour, it's variable, C and V. Those are the reasons he uses those terms. But it's something which is not justified by the logic he's just used to say that it's constant in that case. So he made a logical leap which contradicted where he started from, and he tried to stay where he started from at the same time. And you find this throughout the argument, that he clearly applies the logic to labour, stuffs it up when he applies it to machinery. So he's talking about, looking back at Smith, he's saying more labour is exchanged for less labour from the labourer's viewpoint. And Smith's merit is he emphasises this and perplexes him at the same time. Okay? Why does this happen? He does not see how this contradiction arises. It's because its use value, and which therefore has nothing to do with its exchange value, is precisely the energy that creates exchange value. So here he's clearly applying the logic to critique Smith and say Smith's understanding of the classical school was incomplete because he didn't understand this use value exchange value dialectic. I do, and therefore I can clarify what Smith didn't actually properly understand. So there's a richness to this, and a very, very incisive when he applies it to critique the other schools of thought, or his own members of the school of thought who didn't quite understand the classical theory as well as he did. But when it comes to machinery, and as he said about the labour, talking about labour there, he said its use value, which therefore has nothing to do with its exchange value. When he comes to talking about a machine, he's saying the use value and the machine exchange value are identical, which contradicts his logic. Now, Desai was one person who did attempt to reconcile these two. Meghnad Desai wrote it. He has a book where I think the most interesting part of the book is the inside cover, where he does a brilliant job of doing the overall circuits of money and capital. Truly, truly brilliant. It's a great piece of work. But in this book, he understood the use value exchange value logic, in a sense. He knew it was part of Marx's logic. He tried to make it consistent with the labour theory of value. And what he ended up doing was contradicting another part of Marx's central logic. So here is Desai talking about this and saying the gap between the exchange value of labour power and its use value becomes important, so it's identifying the logic Marx uses. The use value is the value added by the labour. It's in excess of the exchange value. This gap is surplus value. Spot on. Completely correct. Then what he tries to do is use the same argument to explain why machines don't produce surplus value. And what he uses, which is a fairly classical concept at the time he was writing, given the development theory that existed at the time, he uses unequal exchange. He says that the reason there's a difference is because the capitalist is selling the machine, not the labour. Labour creates surplus value by the fact of the unequal relation in the market for labour. So now it's an exploitation argument. Unequal power. Of the three factors of production of machines and raw materials are bought and sold by capitalists, and hence there is no possibility of surplus being extracted. Yeah.
So, but if he defines, like formally he defines the exploitation rate by surplus value divided by variable capital. So if the machine actually contributes surplus value, this makes the whole exploitation story even more severe.
Yeah,
because in the denominator, let's say there is one worker, and normally you extract 3 surplus value units, and now if the machine actually creates surplus value, the denominator increases, so the whole of the exploitation rate just increases.
Yeah, effectively what this argument says, Marx's logic says, capitalists can exploit machinery as well as exploiting labour. Okay, so it's generalising the case. It's not. It's actually saying there's more surplus being produced than you get out of the strict labour theory of value.
But there, I could argue maybe that he just tries to explain exploitation regarding labor. Like as you said before, like this common currency kind of needs to make his whole theory work is labor. He could have chosen capital and say, okay, surplus is created out of capital also, then he would do this all of his theory to capital, like kind of shift it towards capital, but he just chose labor.
Well, I think because
there's the sort of relation that is more reflective.
It's not just that; it's also once you have the labour theory of value, if you accept that, then with the idea about increasing capital to labour ratios over time, you get the declining rate of profit, which is his explanation for where socialism would come from. So it's caught up with the whole political agenda as well. That's why he did it. But here is, just back to Desai in this frame, here's Desai's explanation for using the use-value exchange-value dialectic, but still concluding that labour is the only source of value or profit, because labour is the one commodity that's sold by the worker and bought by the capitalist. Now that contradicts what Marx calls his laws of exchange. He says a worker who buys commodities with 3 shillings appears to the seller in the same fashion as a king who does the same. In other words, you can't use the class relationship as the buyer as your explanation for surplus. He said, whether you can do it, you're not doing anything particularly clever. So here again, Marx in Capital, saying the circumstance that the daily sustenance costs half a day while the worker works for a whole day is a without doubt a piece of luck for the seller, but by no means an injury to the seller. So he's saying there's no class, no exploitation in the classic sense of the word going on here. The seller is getting the same price that any seller of a commodity gets for the commodity that person sells. And here's the clearest statement about you can't use unequal exchange in Marx's logic. To explain, therefore, the general nature of profits, you must start from the theorem that commodities are sold at their real values and profits are derived by selling them at their values. He then says, if you cannot explain profit upon this supposition, you cannot explain it at all. So Desai's way of trying to make that use-value exchange-value logic consistent was overriding one of Marx's, again, major arguments. So he's using the dialectic to sustain a conclusion that machines can't produce surplus value, but doing it by contradicting the basic argument that things exchange at their exchange value. So what you get is commodities exchange at their values, and the exchange values are unrelated to use values. In the CMC circuit, use values are qualitative and they're irrelevant to economics, but MCM plus they're quantitative and they're unrelated to exchange value. Therefore, the capitalist can make a profit out of all inputs. And all the inputs together are needed to produce a physical surplus as well. So no one input is privileged over any other. And that's consistent with the way this Raffian economists think and post-Keynesian economists think. Is one reason why, I'm not trying to convert Marxists in the same sense I'm not trying to convert neoclassicals. Waste of time. Okay? They can go on believing what they believe. What I'd rather do is use this as a sound foundation for what I see as a progressive school of thought in economics, which is the post-Keynesian school. But they haven't yet got themselves a theory of value. So I want to show how you can make this the theory of value that ties together everything, including financialisation, which we're slowly getting towards. But one essential point here is that the thermodynamical issues I raised earlier, this is not in contradiction with them. It's not based upon them. But you're saying all inputs can produce a surplus. You're saying all inputs can help transform free energy. Okay? So it's not inconsistent. It's more like not as consistent as the physiocrats were, but it's making it possible to say all inputs are going to be part of the process we use to take that free energy and transform matter and make the products we actually want to consume in our society. So that's an enormous amount of prelude here, but I think it was necessary because, for a start, post-Keynesians have to when people say, what's your theory of value, they've got to say, oh, that's all that crazy 19th century stuff we don't need to worry about. But the theory of value that neoclassicals have, the use value, the utility, maximisation, etc., is part of how they generate their theories. It's a foundation from which all the neoclassical theories spring. I think it's a bad foundation, but it's a foundation they all share, it's a common language, and they can develop together. Without that approach, in the non-neoclassical world, we're all reinventing the wheel at all times. So I think Marx actually gave us the wheels. And I want to go through and show how this all builds up in a very positive way. Because it isn't just about where profit comes from or where surplus commodities come from. It goes into a whole range of additional factors. For a start, and this is the one that might be is a surprise to a lot of conventional Marxists, wages exceeding subsistence. You can derive that from Marx, and Marx does derive that. Subjective pricing, of course, the whole value approach I've been using so far is defining value as an objective thing. When you mentioned effort, you're dead right. Value is basically the effort involved in producing something. But just like the neoclassicals can't explain everything with a subjective foundation, you can't explain everything from an objective foundation either. You need to be able to move from one to the other. Now, the neoclassicals never can, which is why they have problems like the Sonnenschein-Mandel-de Breuer problem, a whole range of other ways when they're trying to quantify it, they can't do it. They're trying to add things up. They get the genuine incommensurability problem, meaning they can't add up and getting a downward sloping market demand curve from individuals.
They have their own transformation.
Pardon?
They both have transformation.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. And Samuelson found it out the hard way and had to concede defeat, which the neoclassicals themselves don't know. Well, let's start now with some of these concepts. And what you get is a whole argument for independent interacting price levels in capitalism and tensions and the forces of change. To start with wages, most Marxists tend to assume that the wage is equal to the value of labour power. And then when you see people doing measurements to say we've got like a 93% labour theory of value, they're often going on current measured wages and using that as a proxy for the value of labour power. When you read Marx, and believe me I have, every time he uses the word value of labour power and the wage, he uses the word minimum wage, not the average wage, not the actual wage. There's 7 times he does it, between 1844 and when he died in his published writings, and those 7 times he used minimum. So for the time being, necessary labour is supposed as such, the early analysis in Volume 1 of Capital, that the worker always attains only the minimum of wages. It said, this supposition is necessary to establish the laws of profit in far as they're not determined by the rise and fall of wages or the influence of landed property. Okay? So all these fixed suppositions themselves become fluid in the further course of development. In other words, he's using this dialectic to say, let's ignore some things now, be consistent within this realm, and then move on to the next realm, and we don't ignore them anymore, we expand and generalise them. So this is what's missed by a lot of Marxists, again, when they read Marx. They take the first 7 chapters of Capital, where he uses gold as the money commodity, and have gold representing embodied labour time and so on. That's just because he doesn't want to think about money at that stage, and he's legitimately leaving it out at that point in the analysis.
So what we call heuristic.
Yeah, it's heuristic, and and this is, again, if you read, that's by Musgrave.
The Musgrave paper.
Great paper by Alan Musgrave, well worth reading. He talks about the nature of assumptions. So Marx is using this as a heuristic. He's abstracting from something, and you can. Pardon?
The paper?
Alan Musgrave.
It's the one we had to read last week.
Huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Now so the 1846. That's Proudhon. That's the philosophy of 1861. That's theories of surplus value. Theories of surplus value again. So wherever you see him mentioning it, he's talking about the value of labour power being the minimum wage. Now, how can that be true and be consistent? Well, it's another dialectic. The worker is both a commodity and a non-commodity. Okay? Capitalism focuses upon the commodity aspect, which pushes the non-commodity elements into the background. If you're a pure commodity, you'd be paid just a subsistence wage. Because you're a non-commodity, you demand a share in the surplus. There's a dialectical tension between the two. You'll struggle over the minimum wage, over social wages, working conditions, etc., etc. So the wage will normally exceed subsistence. Subsistence is a minimum. When you're getting that, you're being treated just as a commodity. So income distribution dynamics stand up as a natural part of capitalism. And again, putting it in that framework, you have capitalist society. We're now looking at labour as the entity. You focus upon the commodity aspect, so you try to pay a subsistence wage. But the background is you're not a commodity, you're going to organise, you're going to demand a share of the surplus and so on. There'll be a tension between the two. The wage will normally exceed, therefore, the value of labour power. Okay? So that's the next dialectic Marx moves on to. Now, it's now an explanation. This, rather than labour and labour power being an explanation for where surplus comes from in the first place, it's now an explanation for why the value of labour power is the minimum wage, which is quite a shift, which workers will normally receive more than the value of labour. And what have we got over this side? Okay. The reason for this is because about 12 years ago, I got sent a physics paper, econ and physics paper, to referee. And what had happened in the paper was these physicists had attempted to build a mathematical model of the distribution of income in capitalism using two components. One component was wealth. Having wealth generates income. Okay? The other was trade. And so they had these two mechanisms, and they were trying to explain the overall distribution of income they found in America using these two mechanisms. Now they found, and they were puzzled by this, the only way they could make this mechanism fit the data was if they had presumed the trade element was biased in favour of the poor. Okay? They had no idea why, but that's the only way they could make the set of equations they used fit the data, was to say that the trade component, they had income from wealth, which gave you a parallel distribution for the extremely wealthy, but to fit the lower end of the tail of distribution, lower incomes, they had to presume that trade was biased in favour of the poorer of the traders. So this was quite a puzzle to them. And it was a puzzle to me when I first received it, because I again, like generally speaking, even though I had this analysis a decade earlier or more, you fall into thinking, well, workers are going to get ripped off, aren't they? Aren't they going to get less? Now, I then realised, hang on a sec, these guys have empirically confirmed Marx's argument that the value of labour power is the minimum wage. Because in that case, if you actually got the value of labour power as your wage, there'd be no bias in you'd get the fair amount, and you'd have a lower level of income you'd get than if you got more than the value of labour power. So this is the argument they made, and of course my referee comments became part of the paper, including Marx's logic in there. They said we attempt to replicate the empirical distribution of wealth using a model in which there are only two ways you can accumulate it, by investment and by trading. Now, by investment they mean anything that creates or destroys wealth. So that's building a factory or buying shares or anything of that nature. Whereas trade, we said transactions. Instead, we focus upon a non-linear stochastic trade model, and it has three elements they found were necessary. Trade involves a transfer of wealth because you'll be out of equilibrium. If you're in equilibrium, there's no transfer of wealth, no loser and no winner. They said, secondly, the amount moved has to be limited by the wealth of the poorer, so you can't transfer more than the wealth of the poorest in a particular transaction. But the third point, the price is socially determined in such a way that the trade is biased in favour of the poorer trader. And bear in mind, this paper was sent to me before they didn't realise Marx's argument here. So my referee comments wrote back and said, well, Marx actually makes this point, which is intriguing. So they then included Marx's logic in the paper, which wasn't a first for a physics paper, but it was unusual. Yeah? This is how these things happen. Yeah.
So how...
You see, physicists have been trying to...
The thing is, like, I see here a problem with, like, formalizing it. Maybe, like, Marxist thought too much. Recently I've read a lot of ideology critiques. And if you think about, like, subsistence nowadays, it's not the subsistence we used to have.
Absolutely,
subsistence is having a phone, which are all mechanisms of reproducing capitalist production.
Yep.
If you interpret it in the orthodox sense.
Yeah.
So if you further develop this argument, the worker doesn't win anything by trade, because he's like, the dependency for the worker to capitalist production just increases.
I disagree with that, because again, if you end up getting just enough to subsist and that's it, that's what tends to lead to social breakdown, people putting clogs inside machinery, etc., etc. So
then the paper, this physics paper, also spoke there of this that contribution was explosive. Did they also prove that Marx's crisis theory is correct?
No, they didn't do that. This is just about wealth distribution. But I'm going to come back to that topic in later lectures when I start doing the modelling here. So they say, again, this is the way they're quoting me on what I gave them on Marx, and saying there should be an economic bias in favour of the workers because they should include not just the subsistence payment but also part of reflecting their power to bargain over the distribution of income. So for a start, it's been empirically verified by people who weren't attempting to empirically verify. That's what I find quite fascinating. That's why I mentioned I saw the paper to be refereed before they had any comments about Marx at all in the paper. Okay? So it was a nice little discovery. Also, I focus very heavily on a model that Marx has, a verbal model in Volume 1, Chapter 25, which is inexplicable in the context of the rest of Capital, where he's talking about labour getting its value. Okay? Throughout the first volume of Capital, Marx, generally speaking, says workers will receive the value of labour power, and that's where profit comes from. He doesn't actually elaborate in any great detail. But this particular argument turns up when he's discussing Smith at one point in chapter 25, and he says accumulation, there's two possibilities he goes through. There's equilibrium applying or non-equilibrium. He says accumulation slackens given the rise in the price of labour because there's a boom going on. That means the rate of accumulation lessens. Two-class analysis. So increasing wages means less profit for capitalists. With less profit, there's less investment. Therefore, the disproportion between capital and exploitable labour disappears. The price of labour falls again to the level corresponding to the expansion of capital. So you've got a cycle in the workers' wages and profit share of the economy. And he finishes up with a little flourish saying, to put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages is dependent upon the rate of accumulation. Now, Marx actually spent a fair bit of his retirement years trying to learn calculus. We believe it's because he was trying to put this into mathematical form. If he'd done it, he would have predated mathematicians by about 40 years. Unfortunately, he didn't manage to pull it off. But this was a predator-prey model, the very first in that sense. So that was a huge contribution. So we now have an argument for a wages-income distribution cycle in capitalism. What about effective demand? Well, the whole idea about surplus value is about producing surplus commodities, not surplus money yet. You've got to actually sell the commodities to turn that surplus physical goods into surplus money, which is what your endeavour is as a capitalist. So in this, you've got Marx broke the whole MCM plus down into several stages. This is where Decide does a great job in that initial inside cover flowchart of showing all the various relationships in a capitalist economy. So you go money, commodity, production. Okay, you use money, you bought commodities which include machines as well as labour, and you're now doing production. And then in that particular stage, what you're trying to do is generate more outputs than inputs. Okay, so you don't need to worry about the use value at that stage at all of what you're producing. But if you want to go from P, having produced the goods, to having more money, then those goods have to be perceived as useful by the people you're selling them to, which is twofold. They've got to be useful products, they can't be ed cells, okay, and they've got to be produced in proportion to the aggregate demand that exists for them. So you have a higher value, but you're trying to turn that into money. So Marx is now saying that you've got a specifically higher value because there's more labour in it. But now what you're trying to do, you've got a commodity which you have to realise. You have to convert these surplus goods into money, okay? Which now means the use value dominates when you try to turn those surplus commodities you produced into money. In two senses, the use value now matters more than the exchange value. So what you get is an argument that you can have a barrier in terms of realising surplus value by producing more use value than is necessary, or, which means in the aggregate, or less use value in the individual. You produce a shitty product which you can't sell. So you said there has to be an equivalent for the people who are willing to pay money for what you've produced to turn those surplus goods into surplus money. And so you now have a problem with the magnitude of available equivalents, primarily money. Money is now turning up in Marx's logic. He said the surplus now requires a surplus equivalent. In other words, you've got surplus goods, you're trying to turn those into surplus money. There has to be an equivalence of some sort between those two for that to happen. You've now got a second barrier, and that's effectively effective demand. He said use value has to be present at a limited specific quantity, a quantity whose measure does not lie in the amount of labour objectified in it, so the embodied labour, but its nature is use value. It's got to be useful for others, both individually useful and produced in scale to demand. So what you now have is stuff that anticipates Keynes on effective demand turning up in Marx, again which you can't find if you stick with just the labour theory of value interpretation. So use value now dominates over exchange value. And this gives you an effective demand dialectic. You have the CNC circuit now. You're going from commodities to money back to commodities again. The foreground is use value is essential for sale. The background is you produce those goods to produce a profit. The pretension is you might not actually realise that profit. There's no guarantee that the surplus goods you've managed to produce in the production process are going to be saleable in sufficient quantity for you to make a profit. So you now invert the importance of use value and exchange value. When you start talking about effective demand, it's the use value that matters, both individual elements and also in the aggregate. And it links to his critique of say as well, which I don't talk about as much in these lectures. I've taken that out for various reasons, but I'll happily go into that later if necessary. So now you get the next level is money. Because the classical interpretation, I haven't read a lot of De Bruyn, I've read enough to be bored and stop reading, is that money is a commodity money. Money effectively represents embodied labour power, gold is the money commodity, etc., etc. That was something which, again, I took that quote about saying all these fixed suppositions themselves become fluid in the further course of development. He just used a commodity money to simplify his analysis in the early stages. Now when you move on to the later stages, which turns up in the theories of surplus value and also volume 3 of Capital, there's a credit theory of money. And this is beautifully put here. What now does the industrial capitalist pay, and what therefore is the price of loaned capital? He says, what the buyer of an ordinary commodity buys is its use value. What he pays for it is its value. And so when he says value on its own, he means exchange value. You see? He says, what the borrower of money buys is likewise its use value. Okay? So you're getting money because it has a use value. What do you pay for it? And he says, surely not its price or value, as in the case of ordinary commodities. So he's distinguishing money as a commodity from other commodities here. And you have another commodity, non-commodity dialectic, which is the money, the commodity. He says what a borrower pays for a commodity is not its for money is not its exchange value, the cost of production of money, which is trivial, but its use value. He said its use value lies in producing profit. So the price you're willing to pay for money, borrowed money, depends upon your expectations of future gain. And now you've got a concept of expectations turning up in Marx. So the value of money does not depend on the money as commodities, but on the commodity of surplus value they produce for the owner. So you're trying to get money to produce surplus value. So what you get for money is exchange value of money is set by its use value. So now you get this one. Money is both a commodity and a non-commodity. It's essential and it's exchanged, and you have to have it for exchange. But you don't produce money by combining other commodities. If you do, you're a forger. Okay? You'll end up in jail. So he's saying it must always be in mind here that capital is a commodity, and other relations would be irrational from the standpoint of view of an ordinary commodity. So you have to treat it as a different substance. And he says, similarly, if you want to call interest the price of money capital, then it's an irrational form of price, quite at variance with the concept of price for commodities. So there's a different foundation for talking about interest than there was for physical commodities. So how can you have a price that's not its value? Well, this is again, Marx poses this question himself. This is in volume 3 of Capital. Price, after all, is the value of a commodity as distinct from its use value. A price which differs in value and quality is an absurd contradiction. These are not notes that he had edited himself, of course. This is put together by Engels. What is sold is its use value, whose function in this case is to produce exchange value. So you want money for its use value. You pay its use, what you perceive as its use value, which is its prospective capacity to help you produce profit in the future. So what you've got is expectations and uncertainty turning up in a very structured way in Marx. And you get a dialectic of money on top of the dialectic of the commodity and of labour and effective demand. So here's that concept. You have the MCM plus circuit now. Money, the foreground it's a commodity, the background it's a non-commodity. You can't produce money by combining other goods together. Okay? So the dialectical tension here means the exchange value is set by the use value, but the use value is subjective. Okay? It involves your subjective expectations of the future. So there's not an objective basis anymore for the amount of money you're willing to pay to get more money, the price of interest. So again, there's a great richness to Marx seen in this fashion. So competition doesn't determine. This is in volume 3 of Capital. I've got the page references. They're all through the Progress Press edition, but you can find them if you go onto the Marxism website, marxist.org, which still exists despite attempt by the publisher to shut it down. You can find all that. You just search for any piece of text here, you'll find the actual page references. They're all references. So he said there's no such thing as a natural rate of interest. Now again, that sets him apart from the neoclassicals. And he's got a logical basis for saying there's no natural limit to the rate of interest. So it's quite arbitrary and lawless. But again, you can now put this together and understand why he reaches these conclusions using this dialectical framework. So interest is merely part of profit. The maximum limit is the profit itself. Actually, you can go beyond that. But he said the minimum is indeterminable. There will all be counteracting forces to raise it above the relative minimum. So there's a great richness to Marx turning up with this perspective that you can't get out of the labour theory of value. Now, pricing of capital assets also has a dialectic. So partly what Desai was talking about has got a certain logical foundation, but it's a further stage of this dialectic. So consider an unrealised asset, a mine, or a deposit of coal or a deposit of uranium, something in the ground. Okay, how do you price it? Now he quotes Ricardo here and says the compensation given for the mine or quarry is paid for the value of all coal or stone that can be removed from them, and has no connection with the original powers of the land. So he's arguing it's just the value. Ricardo says the value of the coal determines what you'll pay to buy a coal mine. Now, here's Marx. No, that's wrong. There's a significant connection with the original indestructible productions of the soil, which again is where this thinking is compatible with thermodynamics now, saying that actually plays a part of the price you're willing to pay. The word of value here is just as ugly as the word repaid himself with profit was above. And he keeps on going and saying because when you look at an undeveloped mine, there is no value in it. The value of a mine, the value of let's say you find a deposit of 10 billion tonnes of coal, the value of that, in a sense, is the value of the drill hole that was drilled down to find this coal down there and measure it out. It's the value of the surveyors. That's all the values that have gone into it. There's no labour apart from the labour that's been done by somebody who identified there's a deposit down there. And Marx goes into this nice piece of detail. He says Ricardo never uses the word value for utility or usefulness or value and use. So he's pointing out the same thing I pointed out a while ago, that when Marx uses value on its own, he means exchange value. Marx is saying Ricardo is the same on that front. Does he therefore mean to say the compensation is paid to the owner of the quarries for the value of the coal and stone before they are removed from the quarry in their original state? Then he invalidates his entire doctrine of value. This is one of my favourite phrases in Marx coming up now. Or does value mean here, as it must do, the possible use value, and hence the prospective exchange value of the coal or stone? So you've now got a subjective expectation of use value. Well, that subjectivity is about whether you're going to make more money out of opening up the mine and producing from it than you will face leaving it in the ground. So you have, this is the idea that the value of capital assets is also set by their use value. So you pay more for a capital, or potentially more or less, because in a crisis like we're going through right now, of course people pay far less than the reproduction value of capital, but during a boom they can pay far more. So what you get is expectations and uncertainty turning up as part of Marx's thinking about capital. Possible use value, prospective exchange value. So you have at least three price levels now coming out of this analysis. You have a dialectic of the commodity, which explains the existence of surplus, with commodities exchanging at their value. A dialectic of labour, where there's a minimum price for labour. And a dialectic of money and capital, where you get the price you'll pay for machinery or for factories or for shares set by the possible use value and prospective exchange value of the goods you're looking at. And you can also extend it to cover what the Austrians talk about, which is important, which is new products turning up. Because if you look at what really a commodity is a product which is produced for sale and is used in the production of other commodities. Now, when you think about it, when that implies iron, coal, all the sort of stuff we take for granted these days, obviously are commodities. But when it was first invented, an iPod was not a commodity. You needed commodities to make an iPod, but an iPod was not a part of producing any other commodities. Now, in a sense, it is. It's part of producing a cup of coffee. Okay? There'll be an iPod or something like that in the background playing music in the coffee shop, which you expect to have happen. So initially, when these things first turn up, they are not commodities in the full sense. And Ricardo was probably better on Marx than this front. They're talking in this case about unique works of art and stuff like that, and saying that there are rare commodities where their value is totally independent of the labour necessary to produce them. So that's Ricardo's explanation for the prices of Picassos and stuff like that. So what you get, thinking in Marx's terms of use value and exchange value for commodities which are goods which are newly produced, they're not yet part of the whole commodity system of production. So it's justified to say in their case that you have a new commodity turning up, a new products. The foreground is that they're a non-commodity, they're not yet used to produce other commodities. The background is that they are produced by means of other commodities. The price you're willing to pay will be set by subjective questions. So I'm willing to pay a fortune to get the world's first 360-degree camera, for example, which I'll be using hopefully when it turns up in a couple of weeks' time to record the lectures rather than my webcam right now. Early adopters are willing to pay a price based on their subjective valuation of something. Okay? So you get an incredible richness coming out of this with multiple conflicted price levels. For normal commodities, Sraffian input-output pricing works fine, but I'm not going to get you an equilibrium vector out of that, of course. For labour, you have a minimum wage with predator-prey type dynamics for distribution of income. For effective demand, you get periodic failures to realise surplus value, so crises turn up in capitalism, but not terminal ones. With money and capital assets, you're going to get Minsky price fluctuations in asset prices and expectations, and hence debt and so on. And with non-reproducible products or novel products, then the Austrian dynamics matter. So you get a way of integrating some of the useful stuff that comes out of the subjective theory of value. So we get an invalidity of Say's law coming out of this in one sense as well, because in Say's law, basically only existing money pays for new products. Here we get with Marx, we also get an essential role for the creation of money. He wasn't somebody I'd put down in the endogenous money camp necessarily, but he saw the capacity of banks to create money by double entry bookkeeping. He was aware of that, and so that's one reason why I said money is not a normal commodity. You get dynamics coming out of it because there's conflict built in. There's distribution dynamics that necessarily turn up. Can you realise the profit you've actually produced in physical terms? Growth of output becomes integral, debt becomes integral. So you get a very non-neoclassical vision of capitalism coming out of it. And I think this is why I've gone through all the song and dance for the first two lectures before talking about financialisation in general. Because you start from an objective theory of value, but you can capture elements where subjectivity matters. You get profit coming out of the use value, exchange value dynamic. You get income distribution dynamics coming out of wages exceeding subsistence. You get effective demand crises, and you get the role of money as well. So I think it's a complete vision. And I cannot say what Minsky read in Marx because he never wrote down a single reference for reasons I went through last week and which are obvious politically. But I think he imbibed a lot of this, and he was also trained by Schumpeter, who's another classic, effectively dialectical thinker with his evolutionary arguments. So all this will turn up when I start talking about Marx in general. Let's just summarise with the final elements. This is the basic organising concept I think behind Marx's dialectics. This idea of society, an embodied unity, society focusing upon a foreground, the background still existing, so a tension between the two. When you look at the commodities, as Marx says at the end of the Grundrisse, the essential unity in capitalism, then its exchange value is distinguished from its use value. The exchange value sets the price. The source is a surplus value, same basic argument. Labour is the foreground is the exchange value, the background is its capacity to produce goods for output, for capital. The source is a surplus value are explained. Income distribution, you have labour. If it's treated as a fully commodity, it only gets its exchange value. It's not a commodity, it'll demand a share. You get wage distribution dynamics coming out of that. With effective demand, you have commodities which have been produced for sale and have to be saleable. You're trying to produce a profit out of them. Dialectically, you might fail to do that. The money and banking system, money is a commodity. It's essential for exchange, but it's a non-commodity. You can't produce money by means of other commodities. It's got to be a social convention that does that. So its exchange value is set by its use value. New commodities and early adopters, you can argue again that subjective utility will play a role in setting price. And you're still consistent with Marx. So to me there's an enormous richness to this way of thinking about Marx. I'm happy to leave the Marxists talking about the labour theory of value. To me this is a way of talking about a progressive way of designing an alternative approach to neoclassical economics, which I'll start doing properly next week. I'll leave it at that for the moment.